Hey, welcome to the gaming bench. Today I'm going to make a 9 men's Morris board out of leather, just like this one. If you want to know more about the game 9 men's Morris, I have another video that outlines the rules, strategy, and history of the game. I'll link that in the description below. And if you've never worked with leather before, I have yet another video that outlines the basics of leather craft. Terminology, price, where to buy, what to look for, that sort of stuff. Also linked below. Okay, let's get started. Okay, first thing we need to do is cut the leather. I have a double shoulder of 6-7 ounce leather that I've recently bought. This is a straight edge that comes from the manufacturer, and I'm going to make it the same size as this previous game board that I made. So I'm going to use the straight edge from the factory, lay the board up against it, and just trace it out with a pencil. I'm tracing it out on what's called the flesh side. This is the side of the leather that was attached to the cow. That's different from this side, which is called the grain side or the hair side. So with that drawn in, I'm only going to use a couple simple tools. I'll use straight edge, just a regular old box cutter, and I'll probably use these leather shears later on. So I'll just line this up with the straight edge. So when cutting through leather, try to keep your knife parallel or perpendicular to the leather you're cutting. And when you're dealing with thick leather, don't try to cut it all at once. Make a series of lighter passes. If you try to put too much pressure on it all at once, you're going to end up slipping and either cutting a weird line in the leather or cutting yourself. Something that I was told when I first started working leather is that you're made of leather. So any tool that is designed to cut leather will also cut you. So be careful. All right, I'm going to free these corners. Okay. This corner isn't quite right, so I'm going to trim that. All right, and there's the piece of leather we'll use for our game board. I'm going to take another quick look at it and see how square I've cut it, because I'm not always great about cutting straight lines. And this isn't perfect, but it's not bad. All right. For the next step, we're going to get the leather wet. This helps it take impressions and embossing better than it does when it's dry. A couple ways to do that. When I'm working with what I consider a medium weight leather like this, sometimes I just run it under the faucet both sides to get it kind of damp. But probably the easiest way to do it is just get a shallow pan of warm water and drop your leather into it. Make sure it's completely submerged. And once you put it in, you'll see that it starts to bubble. So that's the water releasing the air that's in the leather. So I've seen people that think that you need to case leather for hours or until it's overnight. That's ridiculous. Really, you only need to do it for like a minute. When the bubbles start coming out, your leather's pretty saturated and you should be good to go. All right. So normally I would wipe off this leather, but it's still pretty wet it has water on the surface, and I'm going to use that to help hold the paper template that I have in place. This is just a 9 men's Morris board that I've designed on my computer, and I'm going to just try to get it kind of even on the leather. and the wet water on the surface will help hold it into place. All right. So now I'm going to transfer the pattern from the paper onto the leather. And this is a really simple pattern because all you have are circles and straight lines. So for the straight lines, I'm just going to use the straight edge, and I'm going to use this tool. It's a clay sculpting tool that has a soft silicone tip on one side and a ball stylus on the other side. The ball stylus is the important part. So this is kind of a smallish size, and I'm just going to use it to lightly inscribe the lines into the leather. You don't have to push too hard. We're not trying to do anything, really. We're not trying to put a permanent design into the leather yet. This is just so that there's a light design on the leather, so I know where to come back later and inscribe those lines a little more deeply. Pretty good. And now to emboss the circles on the design, you can get custom made or purpose made leather stamps that are just circles, but they're kind of expensive for what you get. And what I usually end up using is my socket set. So here is an 11 and 32nd socket. I think that's a pretty good size. So, I'm just going to use a mallet, and again, lightly emboss all the circles into the design. And I'm going to take one more look, make sure I didn't miss anything. And that looks pretty good. Now I'll get some of the water off the surface. And when you're tooling leather, not just lightly transferring the design, but when you're permanently putting the design into the leather, you don't want your leather too wet. If it's too wet, it'll tend to spring back and the design won't take. And there's no perfect way to do this. It's going to depend on the quality of your leather, the thickness of your leather, the humidity, where you're working, the phases of the moon. There's a lot of different variables. So I'm going to let this sit just for like a minute or two and dry out just a little bit. And then I'm going to come back and transfer the design in there for good. All right, this has been sitting here drying just for a couple minutes. There's no more standing water on the surface. It's still cool to the touch. Something you may be able to notice is that there's a bunch of red flakes all over the leather. And that is something that shouldn't be there. There must have been some leftover dye residue on my bench, and I set the leather down on it, and it picked it up there, and the water activated. But I'm not worried about it because I'm going to dye this a darker color when I'm done with it. So hopefully this won't show, or if it does show, I don't know, maybe it looks like a fun grain pattern. All right, I'm going to take the same socket set, and I'm going to begin embossing all of the circles. I'm just going to line it up to where my transfer mark is and give it a pretty good smack to make sure the design transfers to the leather. If while you're doing this you find that the design isn't really staying, your leather's probably too wet, so give it another couple minutes to dry. All right, go over it, make sure I didn't miss anything. That's all the circles. And now I'm going to take my straight edge and my ball stylus and just go over the lines that I transferred into it. Like cutting the leather, you don't need to be super aggressive while you're doing this. maybe do 1 or 2 lighter passes to emboss it. The bottom line is you want to maintain control over what you're doing, because if you press too hard or you go too fast, you may end up skidding off the straight edge or otherwise making a mistake. And those are the worst mistakes, the ones that are easily avoidable. All right, now I'm going to give this a once over to make sure that I didn't miss any lines. That looks pretty good. And now what I'm going to do is go over the lines one more time and just make sure that everything connects the way it's supposed to. I'm going to go over the circles a little bit more to make sure that they look right. All right, so I've kept this purposely pretty simple, but if you wanted to add leather stamps or make it fancier, now would be the time to do it while the leather's still wet. So before we move on to the next step, the leather needs to dry. So again, the amount of time it'll take for your leather to be completely dry is going to depend on a lot of different factors. I usually let this sit overnight just to make sure that it's dry. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let this sit here, and then I'll return in the morning and go on to the next step. Okay, it's been about 24 hours since I finished this, and it's been drying. I checked on it in the morning, and it wasn't drying as well as I wanted it to, so I ended up propping it up on these paint points to get some airflow underneath it, and this looks pretty good. If your leather curls up like this, when it dries, you can just manhandle it back into shape. The leather is pretty forgiving. So the next step is I'm going to add some, well, first I'm going to add a radius to these corners. When I made this last board, I made square corners, which I think look fine, but for a little something different, I'm going to add a radius. So I'm just going to trace over the bottom of this little mixing cup to get me a curved line. And then I'm gonna cut it with my leather shears. Again, being careful to keep the shears perpendicular to the surface of the leather so I don't get a weird angle on the cut. All right, next I am gonna finish these edges a little bit. I don't like the look of this sharp edge on the leather, so I'm gonna use this tool. It's called an edge beveler. Basically, you can see it's just a tiny blade in between 2 prongs. So you hold it against the leather and it cuts a 45-degree chamfer to soften the edge. When you do this, don't do what I've done before, is hold the leather like this, because if you slip, you jam the prongs into your hand, and that is no good. I don't really care if it's a little rough around the radius yet, because I'm not done finishing the edges. All right. I already like the look of that, soften the edges. So the next thing I'm going to do is add some color to this board. I have some red dye that I've poured in this little mixing cup, and I'm going to use a fine tip paintbrush, and I'm going to paint in all the circles and the connecting lines. So I don't have the steadiest hand, so I'm just going to go slow and be careful not to go outside the lines, drip any dye on the surface of leather where I don't want it. And like I said, just be careful. If you end up doing something like this, where you try to paint leather dye onto the leather, just be careful, because leather dye doesn't act like paint. Because it's dye and it's thinner than paint, it's going to want to bleed into the leather. So if you fill up your brush with too much dye, like I said, it'll bleed, and you don't want that. So I just put a little bit on at a time and carefully go over it, and I have to refill the brush often. This can end up with kind of a splotchy, mottled look, so you might have to go over it a couple times to get a solid color. All right, one down. All right, that's all the points done. And maybe you can see that some of them are splotchy, like I said, like here and here and here and here. So what I'm going to do is go over the ones that need a little more coverage one more time, just to see if I can get the dye a little more even. Okay, so not perfect, but pretty good. I'm going to finish this with another coat of a different color dye over top of all of it, so I'm not too worried about it. What I am worried about is now painting in the lines, because again, I don't have the steadiest hand. Like doing the dots, I'm going to just try to go slow and be very careful and not screw it up, because it's the worst thing in the world to get this far on a project and then botch it at the last minute. So I'm just going to paint in the valley of the lines that I've already inscribed. Okay, again, not perfect, but not bad. The last thing I'm going to do on this phase is I'm going to add some of this red to the edges. You may or not be able to see this really well when all is said and done, but it might be an interesting splash of color. So I'm going to use this wool dauber and get it wet, and then carefully go along the edge, trying not to get too much on the front surface. See that? All right, home stretch. The last thing I'm going to do is cover this entire board with a dark brown dye. I did some tests before I started the project to see what I might like. This is the red dots covered with a black dye, and this is the same red dots covered with this dark brown dye, and I really like this. So that's what I'm going to do. For this part, you really want to wear gloves because it gets pretty messy. What I'm going to do is, just like I painted on the dye for the dots, I'm just going to cover the whole thing. I'll use a little piece of wool to cover it. This is the dye I'll be using, and I will just flood this piece of wool with it and then wipe it on little circular motions. I'm applying a little bit of pressure to make sure that the dye gets into all the embossed lines. make sure you don't miss any spots. The important thing is that you don't leave any raw leather. And I'm going to go over the edges that I did in the red too. You don't have to absolutely soak the leather, but you want to put a pretty heavy coat of dye down to make sure that it sinks in and that it has an even coat. You don't want any of that blotchiness that you saw with the red dye. All right. I'm going to flip this over and do the back side too. Not necessary, but I do think it looks a little nicer. The flesh side tends to soak up the dye even more so than the grain side. But I'm not going to put a lot of effort into making this perfect because you're not going to see it for the most part. All right. Get these little fuzzies off. And I know this looks really dark right now, but it'll dry lighter. So that's done. I am going to let this sit overnight to make sure it thoroughly dries. And since I did the back side, I'm going to put it up on these paint points again, just to make sure that the whole thing dries. I'm going to center them a little bit more so that it doesn't bend like it did last time. All right, I'll let this sit overnight, come back in the morning, and we'll see how it looks. This leather has been drying overnight. You can tell that it's nice and dry now. Again, it warped a little bit because of the water content in the dye, but I'm just gonna kind of bend it back into shape so it lays flat. All right, I'm pretty pleased with how that looks. You can still see the red, but the dark brown has softened it in a way that I like. And maybe most importantly, all that weird speckling that I got by having that red dye bleed through is really muted, and it gives it kind of a reddish sheen. Might not show up on camera, but it's pretty cool. All right, the next to last thing I'm going to do on this is finish the edges. So if you can tell, the edges, after I skied them, are still a little rough feeling. So I'm going to clean up the edges a little bit, and I'm going to use this tool. This is called an edge slicker or an edge burnisher. It's just a wooden wheel that has a groove on it. They also sell tools like this. This is a spindle burnisher that has a series of different size grooves for different size leather. I like the wheel. And all you're going to do is take the wheel and run it back and forth across the edge. And that's going to crush the fibers of the leather and give you a nice rounded over profile and a nice slick surface that's going to feel nice to the touch. To make this go a little faster, I'm going to use this product. It's called Gum Tagaranth, and it's just this goo that you can put on the edge of the leather, and it helps with the process of slicking the edges. You don't have to put much on. I'm just going to put a little bit on and then use the burnishing wheel. And all this takes is a little bit of time, a little bit of effort, but pretty quickly you'll start to see results. Already you get a nice, shiny, slick feeling edge. If you do this long enough, the edge almost feels a little plasticky, but in a good way. So I am just going to go around the whole piece, adding a little bit more of this gum trag and putting a little bit of effort into it to finish my edges. You don't have to use the gum trag to get nice edges. You can just wet it a little bit with water. That can help. Or you can use beeswax. I've used that plenty of times too. That gives you a similar result. This product honestly goes a little faster. I presume because it's full of toxic chemicals that will, impair me later in life. But man, what a nice finished edge I get right now. All right. I'll wipe off the excess. Now I have a board with a nice clean edge on it. So at this point, you could absolutely be done. And the board looks great. Obviously, it's playable. I'm going to take one final step because the leather is dyed, but it's really not protected. To protect the leather long term, you need to either add oil to it or put some sort of clear coat over it to seal it. The oil will give it more of a matte finish, which could be nice, but it'll degrade over time, and so you'll have to re-oil the board periodically. The clear coat, on the other hand, will seal the leather and make it waterproof, but it leaves a shiny gloss to it that I don't always like. So I need to decide how I want to finish this. I think I'm going to go with the clear coat because the leather is this brown, it's kind of dull. I think a shine to it will add something nice. I'm going to use this product. It's called Pro Resist. It's meant for a resist when you're antiquing a project like this, but it also is basically a nice glossy top coat. So what I'm going to do is take another one of these wool daubers, get a bunch of it on the dauber, and then like I dyed it, just in circular motions, rub it all across the leather. You don't need a ton. You want to be careful that you don't leave a lot on the surface either, because it can leave bubbles and give you a finish that you don't really want. So you can see it's already started to dry. So I'm just gonna wipe it down to make sure there's you can't see those swirl lines of when I applied it. I'll do the back side of this piece too after this has a chance to dry, because right now it's a little tacky. It doesn't take long to dry, but I want to make sure I give it time before I flip it over so it doesn't stick to the paper towel. So I'll give that a couple minutes, and then I'll come back and I'll do the flip side. And we're done. Turned out really well. The top coat has given the leather a sheen that gives it a real richness. I think it's a rather elegant 9 Mins Morse board. Again, if you want to learn more about 9 Mins Morse, I have another video linked in the description that talks about the rules, history, and strategy of the game. And if this is the kind of content you enjoy, I put out new videos on the 2nd and 4th Thursday of every month. So hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of the fun builds. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on The Gaming Bench.